Good morning, you cheeky little rascals. We are your nerd theorists, and today we are continuing on with our review of the terrain rules for 40k 10th edition. Now, in the first video, we went over the rules in general. Now we're going to move on and look at each of the 6 new terrain pieces with a more in-depth view of how they work and how they build them. First up, we're looking at craters and rubble. Welcome to 10th edition terrain. Now, I already mentioned this in the first video, but it is important to go over it again because the rules of cover have changed and they are used for every piece of terrain. So, if you are within a crater and the enemy is firing at you, you get a +1 on your save throw. However, you do not get that +1 if your save is a 3+ or better and the weapon firing at you has an armor penetration of 0. Any other occasions you do get the +1, but in those occasions you do not. So line of sight, if neither you or your enemy are within the terrain piece, it is basically not there. They do not block line of sight, they do not give you a +1 on your save. If you and your enemy are outside of the terrain, you just fire on each other as normal. If, however, your Black Templar Space Marine is within the terrain piece and the Necron Warrior is on the outside firing in, this Space Marine would get a +1 on its saving throw for any ranged attacks made towards it. This is because the Gauze Flayer that the Necron is firing has a -1 armor penetration and the Space Marine has a +3 save. Therefore, he will get the extra +1 on his saving throw. Now things get a little bit more complicated because we now have an Orc War Boss firing at our Space Marine Intercessor. Now the Intercessor has a +3 save. The War Boss has a combi rocket. Now the rocket part of the combi rocket has a -2 AP, but the shooter part of the combi rocket has a -0. Therefore, if the Orc decides to fire his rocket at the Space Marine does get the benefit of cover and a +1 on its saving throw. However, if the Orc fires its shooter at the Space Marine, because the shooter has a 0 as AP and the Space Marine has a +3 on save, the cover doesn't affect it. This is where it does get a little bit confusing, but once you get it into your head, it's all gravy. So that is how to use them, and remember that craters and rubble is just the name for this terrain piece. It covers a massive variety of terrain if you want to make it yourself, and we will show you how to make the crater in a moment. It basically means it's a large piece of terrain that a model can finish its move in. So as long as it's a decent size and it's got a flat area in the middle and your models can finish in it, that is classed as craters and rubble, and that would use this rule set. So as well as craters and rubble, you could have a massive monster's nest or a huge hollowed out tree stump or anything that's got enough space in the middle of it for your models to finish their move in that wouldn't be a structure, because that would then come under ruins. Although it's up to you and your mates what you want to call your pieces. You decide at the beginning of the game what that terrain piece is and you follow the rules to suit. So now let's have a look at making it. This is the crater that we were using for the example, and this is the one that I have made, and we will now look how to make it, because I made this all by myself. It took bloody ages. I've been drying the glue with a hairdryer just about to knock this video out. Let's see what we did. Okay, firstly you need to eat a whole box of Cookie Crisp cereal. Then you cut the front out of it and you're going to use that as your base. Use the shiny side because that's less absorbent and it won't warp so much when you put your paint and your glue on it. Then you want to make a ring out of rope or old wire or anything that's raised enough to make a substantial ring, and that will be the base of your crater. Once your ring is dry, you can then start building up the slope on the outside of it. Now you want a gradual slope on the outside of the ring and a steep on the inside. So don't put anything on the inside of the ring, you're going to leave that as it is. And on the outside, cut some thin strips of cardboard and just stick them on all the way around just to give a nice gradual slope up to the crater itself. Once they're all glued down, you're going to do it again, overlapping this time to make sure you're filling all the gaps, because you are going to be filling over the top of this with wood filler. So you don't want any gaps, you want it to be relatively smooth throughout. Don't get too over the top with it, but just make sure that there aren't any gaps. And now we get messy. You want some wood filler or poly filler or any sort of filler. It doesn't really matter. I'm using wood filler here just because I had some knocking about. It's cheap and cheerful. You can get it from most pound shops for a small tub or any hardware shop for a couple of quid. And you're basically covering the whole thing. Give it a good texture. Don't put it on smooth. You want it to look like mud, dirt, rock, whatever. Slather it all over, and then where the rope was, you might want to build it up a little bit more just to give it a more distinct raised edge. Now, dependent on the temperature of your house, you're going to have to wait a good 24 to 48 hours before that filler is dry. But once it is, you then want to start decorating your terrain with anything that you can find that looks like it's exploded. Basically, I've used pieces of corrugated card here to be corrugated steel. I've used some old pipes from a pond filter. I've used pieces of terrain that were left over from other bits and bobs. There's all sorts on it. Broken lolly sticks, broken kebab skewers, everything. Just wang them all on. I've even used some bits of slate that I stole from next door's garden, so hopefully she won't watch this. Give your bits and bobs about half an hour to dry, and then you want to start filling in the gaps. Now, you can again use filler, but you want a rougher texture now, and under normal circumstances I would recommend using a textured base paint. But I've discovered this stuff, this big pot here that I'm waving at the camera. It is basically very similar to Citadel's technical terrain little paint pots, but it was only £3 from Amazon, and it is basically exactly the same stuff. It finishes with a really nice texture, and I've used that to just fill in all the gaps so it doesn't look like these stones and rubble are just laid on top of the explosion. I wanted them to look like they were actually stuck in, like it's exploded and they've all got stuck in around it. Now, this is pretty much the piece built. It's just a case of painting it. So I have cut the corners off to give it a nicer, smoother edge, and I have primed it in a grey primer. You should use black. I didn't have any black left, so I used grey, and you will be finding that you're filling in little pale gaps for the rest of your life. So use black. Don't do what I've done here. I have used just a bog standard brown acrylic for the mudded areas, because there's no point using expensive paint for this. It's going to just cost you a fortune. Just get your bog standard pound shop brown acrylic and use that to fill in all the mud. Allow that to dry, and then again get yourself some cheap acrylic. You want to get a black and a white, because there's going to be a few different shades of grey in this. Mix it up, but leave it quite dark, because this is going to be for the slate areas, so colour them in quite a dark grey. Now mix a bit more white in with your acrylic to give you a paler grey, and fill in all the rest of the rocky scenery. Once this is done, you might want to stipple a few different shades over the top. I did it off camera because I forgot to press record. But basically, mix up a lighter and darker shade of brown and stipple it on, and do the same with the greys, just to mix it up, because there is a lot of block colour on this model and you want it to look more realistic. Then it's just a case of painting all your little decoration pieces. So it's mostly silver for the pipes and the corrugated wall here. I think I used a off-white for the panels and brown for the wood, obviously. But now you've got what is looking like a proper piece of terrain. Everything's probably going to need 2 coats, so I went over everything again. You can't really see the colours very well on this video, but it is really coming together. But it is far too clean. What we want is a dirty landscape. So the next step is going to be dry brushing. So basically you're dry brushing black or brown over everything. You don't want any bright colours. I did use a pale purple on the slate just to give it that bluey slate colour, but apart from that it was browns and blacks over everything. A paler grey on all the rock and a paler brown on all the mud. But apart from that, on all the edges of all the panels and everything, I used a mucky brown on the metal as well to give it a rusted effect, and then black over some of the areas and the pipe to make it look like it had been burnt. And then it was time for the wash. It was good old Known oil for all of the grey and black areas, and Reichland Flesh Shade for all of the mud. Then I was pretty happy with it. It needed a bit of detailing, but I'm going to allow it to dry, and then we'll add a few little odds and sods to really make it stand out. So for the final touches, I watered down some PVA glue and splashed on a bit on the mud, and then used my static grass applicator to put a bit of grass on the muddy areas. Not too much, because I didn't want it looking like a garden, but just to break up the mud a little bit. I also used a Forge Worlds weathering powder, a rusty red, to go over the metal sections again to make them look really old and knackered. And then I used some unmixed PVA glue and poured it into the central section of the crater so that dried clear to make it look like it was waterlogged. In hindsight, I probably wouldn't do it again. It's taken absolutely ages to dry, and I don't think it really adds anything to the model. But there we go. You can see the bit in the middle if I catch the light, just to make it look like a puddle. But that is your piece. And like I say, these rules cover lots and lots of different bits and bobs, so you could just as easily do just rubble on both sides, a tree stump, a nest, a hole in the ground, a really massive empty milk bottle. I don't know, anything. But that's the rules for craters and rubble. Next up, we'll be looking at something else that I haven't written down, so I don't know what it is. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It's really important, because if you don't, spiders will crawl up your nose while you're sleeping. I don't make the rules. That's YouTube. Have a word. So thank you very much. We hope you've enjoyed it. If there are any questions, and there was a lot of questions after the last video, we are doing our best to iron out all of the details for these terrain rules. Obviously, we've seen as much as you have when it comes to Games Workshop releasing them in snippets. We are quite well read when it comes to the rules for 9th edition. Hopefully we've got everything right. If you notice any mistakes we've made, please point them out, because we don't want to be giving misinformation. And like I say, anything that you would like to know, or any more details on how to make anything, give us a shout. We've got TikTok, we've got Twitter, we've got Instagram, we've got Bebo, we've got MySpace. You could just post us a bloody letter. Thanks for watching. My name's Gaz. We'll see you soon.